Rise and shine, it's game day. Gonna give it all, come what may. Fueling up with the best in mind. DHA's the secret that you'll
Hello, I'm
find.
Bassam Hallak from Omega Ingredients, and welcome to the Good Oil podcast series where we delve into the latest in sports science and nutrition from a DHA perspective. In our last podcast, Greg provided us insights into some fascinating research that highlights the crucial role DHA plays in enhancing sports performance. Today, we're exploring the impact of omega-3 fatty acids on heart function and blood flow during physical training and competition. Joining us today is Greg Peoples from the University of Wollongong, who has conducted pivotal research on this topic. Welcome back.
Hi, Bassam. Thanks for having me back. And it's such an important topic, the heart. It's heart and brain. It's all about,
It's all about the ticker.
the ticker.
How have you enjoyed it so far?
Oh, look, I always love catching up with you, and it's always great to be discussing sort of one of our combined favorite topics, and that's omega-3. So
There
looking
you
forward
go.
to the chat we're going to have today.
Well, let's start off by reviewing some of your critical studies. Your 2008 study published in the Journal of Cardiovascular Pharmacology investigated how fish oil affects heart rate, oxygen consumption during exercise. What were the key findings from this research?
This was a really interesting study. So it was an important translational study, and we talked about in podcast one. This is going back a bit of time, isn't it? That I was studying under Prof. McLennan, and Prof. McLennan had done a lot of work in the cardioprotective role of DHA in particular, and a lot of his work involved animal models. But he set me the task to say, look, I think given that endurance athletes, aerobic athletes
Yeah.
rely on heart function, cardiac output so much, there is a potential role that DHA can help support the heart when it's working for, it's not just minutes, sometimes it's hours, sometimes in ultra distance, it's days. And so, what we set out to do is have a look at the key role of DHA, in particular, using DHA-rich Omega oil in this instance, on heart and heart rate in particular. Now, the question around heart rate, why heart rate? What we notice across the literature, and more so now that we've got another 2 decades worth of research, is that there's this common theme of heart rate reduction that occurs when DHA is incorporated into the diet. And if we go back and have a look at the animal models, and we continue to do animal models in our lab as well, is it's not only in the human heart. When we use the animal models, the animal's heart also beats at a slower rate as well. And you say, well, what's the importance of a lower heart rate? Well, if you look at resting heart rate, we know that from a health perspective, those with a lower resting heart rate seem to have a better longevity overall. And then you say, well, what's important about a low resting heart rate? Well, a low resting heart rate means that the heart is in relaxation for a longer period of time.
Mm.
When it's in relaxation for a longer period of time, it feels better.
Yep.
If it feels better, it's more likely to pump on that next beat and be more effective. It also means that the coronary arteries have a longer period of time to supply oxygen to the tissue. So the fact that DHA has this commonality of reducing, particularly resting heart rate, and in this study that we're going to talk about, exercising heart rate, means that it's modulating the beat rate to then improve the efficiency or the effectiveness of how that heart is actually working, and importantly, how it's supporting itself through coronary blood supply.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we just think about the study, the study was with elite cyclists. I had them on high DHA oil for 8 weeks. Now, just to back a little bit, this was a period. This was early in my career. This was a period of time where we didn't really understand too much about the dose response. So we actually had them on around about 2,000, just a fraction over 2,000 milligrams of DHA. So it is at the higher level. And we had them on for 8 weeks. So we certainly knew that we got an effective response, and it was my study. I took the blood sample before and after, and we proved that the red blood cells had increased their DHA. So we knew they were taking their capsules, and two, we got an effective change between the control and the control group and the supplemental group. We had them ride before and after VO2 max, and then a performance effort. And what we noticed is that in the what we call the clamped activity, those periods of exercise on the bike where we're controlling the amount of work that they're doing, the DHA supplemented group were achieving it with a lower heart rate during that process. So, in other words, their heart was working more effectively to fill and empty. And if you then take that over a prolonged period of time, hours, that's less heartbeats that are required, more cardiac filling, and effective emptying that's occurring
Yeah, yeah.
in those athletes.
Yeah, I suppose we talked about my previous experience in doing long distance triathlons, the Ironman, and then 2018 I did the Ultraman, and we were trained to train in the aerobic state, not anaerobic,
Mm.
because for long distance, does that sort of play in the same of trying to keep the heart rate down?
Yeah, so heart rate is a really interesting outcome for the human body, isn't it? Because heart rate's playing into lots of different things. So while we're exercising, it's contributing to our cardiac output, which is contributing
Mm.
to providing oxygen to our working muscle. But equally, heart rate can be affected by our dehydration states. For
Yeah,
example,
true.
if we become dehydrated, heart rate's going to become elevated. So the commonality around particularly endurance sport is that the heart is put under cardiac load, heart load, through a number of different ways:
Mm.
dehydration, metabolism, all of these things are asking more of the heart. And that heart is like any pump, isn't it? You can wear it out.
Yeah.
So if we can support the heart through increasing the DHA into the membranes, which then go on to create a more effective and efficient heart,
Mm.
the chances are that heart's going to last longer, both during the event and a lifetime.
Longevity, yeah.
And that's actually a really important outcome, is the concept that physical activity is healthy for our heart, but
Yeah.
we also know that too much activity, extreme endurance activity, can have negative effects on the heart as well. The heart can be put under too much stress. So what we're doing here is looking at how DHA can support heart function in the short and the long term in this
Yeah.
instance.
And I'm assuming it's the impact on the heart is definitely the DHA more than the EPA.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a critical thing, and we've talked about that before, is that if we then look at the heart cell membranes, it is the DHA that rapidly increases in those
Yeah.
membranes. And we're talking about that bilipid layer. We really see next to no increase in EPA. And you'll say, well, how did you know that in humans? Now, we didn't take their heart membrane. We have to use our animal studies for that. So
Yeah.
in our animal studies, we have the availability then to take out the cardiac tissue, and we can directly measure the DHA that's in the cardiac tissue of our animal models.
Yeah.
And we don't see the EPA
Sure.
appear. We see very strong changes in our DHA incorporation into those cells.
Yeah. And so, considering the impact on heart rate and oxygen consumption, because they're both related, how does fish oil, which is rich in omega-3 fatty acids, influence heart rate and oxygen consumption during physical activity? What mechanisms are involved in this effect?
Yeah, so if we start with the heart rate is affected by a number of different factors, but in terms of the actual beat that it's working at, we've got two key factors. We have what we call the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is made up of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic arm. So, in brief form, the parasympathetic activity through the vagus nerve
Yeah.
reduces heart rate. Sympathetic nerves, sympathetic activation through the circulation as well, increases heart rate and heart force. So, we refer to that as the autonomic nervous system. But the heart has its own beat rate. So you can actually detach the heart from the autonomic nervous system. And as long as you supply it with oxygen, glucose, all the things it needs, it will continue to beat. And it does that because there's a special area at the top of the heart called the SA node that actually has its own beat rate.
Mm.
Now, if you think about what's happening here, is we're supplying DHA to the cardiomyocytes. So we always think about them as the worker cells, and they make up about 98% of the cells. But there's a electrical pathway through the heart that starts with the sinoatrial node that also incorporates DHA. And what we've identified, particularly through the animal studies where you can remove a heart from the autonomic nervous system, that heart also beats slower as well.
Yeah.
So that tells us that we're actually intrinsically modulating the beat rate of the heart. So the heart itself is
Yeah.
actually slowing down its own beat rate in this
Mm.
instance. There are some evidence from human studies that prove this as well. So, for example, if you take a cardiac transplant patient, they've had their heart changed over, haven't they?
Mm.
So they've had the heart detached from the autonomic nervous system, the new heart's put in. In that instance, the transplant studies also show that the heart rate is reduced with those on omega-3. So it's
Okay.
further evidence that the
Yeah.
omega-3s are directly affecting the heart tissue rather than the autonomic nervous system, which we always sort of went to. The parasympathetic nerve must be getting stronger. Well, the parasympathetic nerve potentially now doesn't need to do as much work because the intrinsic beat rate
Yeah.
is starting to fall. Does that
Yeah.
make
No, it
sense?
makes a lot of sense.
Skeletal muscle, I think, was the other
Yep.
question.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, some interesting observations with improved oxygen efficiency. So part of that study that we talked about before with the elite cyclists, and I gave them, a little over 2,000 milligrams of DHA, as well as their heart rate being reduced by around about 5 to 7 beats during prolonged activity, they were observed to have a lower oxygen consumption for the same workload on the bike afterwards. And what's interesting between the commonality of heart cells and muscle cells is when they're stimulated to contract, they both use calcium inside the cell to coordinate to the actual contractile proteins. So calcium gets spilt out into the cell. It tells the contractile proteins to contract, whether it's a heart cell or a muscle cell. That calcium has to be reuptaken ready for the next beat or the next contraction. That costs oxygen. It actually uses energy. So every time the calcium comes in and out and in and out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it costs energy.
Yeah.
It's oxygen. It's not direct oxygen that's going to making the muscle cell or the heart cell contract, but it's actually going towards actually maintaining the process of contraction. So what we know is that there seems to be a commonality for heart cell and muscle cell with increased DHA on the reduction in oxygen cost. And that seems to be highly related to the efficiency of which calcium is being handled in the cell. How do we know that? Well, I observed it in the cyclists. Okay, so their oxygen consumption was lower despite doing the same work. Prof McLennan decided that I needed a lot more work to do at the time, so he set me a PhD at the time, and I spent my entire PhD looking at the contractile efficiency with DHA in skeletal muscle cells. Now, again, it's very hard to do in humans, so I actually used an animal model for this, and so we had a little called a working hind limb where I can contract the hind limb, measure how much force it's being produced. I actually had bypass surgery going where we could measure how much oxygen was going into the hind limb and out of the hind limb, so we could actually get the efficiency. And then I did some experiments where I created ischemia and hypoxia. I also gave some of the hind limbs boluses of caffeine, and caffeine actually then surges calcium into the cell. And what we noticed is the overall theme was the contracting animal model muscle was more efficient, and it was related to the calcium handling, or inadvertently related to the calcium handling. So if we boil that back in terms of the efficiency, it seems to be that the cell is becoming more efficient in actually handling the process of calcium moving in and out of it's a technical term, the sarcoplasmic reticulum that stores the calcium inside the cell.
And I'm assuming also the DHA is regulating the muscle, so it's not saying I need a lot more oxygen than I need.
Yeah, so the other part of that is, and it's another story again, is that there's some, and we haven't done direct work of this in our lab, but there is evidence that mitochondrial membranes are also changing as well. So we always think of the membrane of the cell of just the actual muscle cell or the heart cell, but mitochondria have membranes too. And that when we increase the amount of DHA in our diet, that we actually modify our mitochondrial membranes. And there's been some good evidence from other labs around the world to suggest that mitochondrial function can be improved, which is actually the powerhouse, isn't it? That's where ATP is actually being produced. And so improvement to mitochondrial function through DHA incorporation into those membranes has been part of the emerging story too.
In your 2014 study published in the British Journal of Nutrition, you found that a increased omega-3 index improved heart rate recovery after exercise. Can you explain how omega-3s contribute to faster heart rate recovery?
A couple of key points about this study. Now, we'd progressed on with our understanding of what dose we needed to provide. So where the 2008 study had provided over 2,000 milligrams of DHA, we were back down now to around about 500 to 600 milligrams of DHA. So we'd progressed enough in our understanding that we didn't need to say swallow 8 capsules. We're actually back down to swallowing 2 high DHA Omega capsules in the 2014 study, which is a really important part because we're from that point on focusing on that key range between 500 and 1,000 milligrams. So that was the first thing that was important about the 2014 study. We'd brought the dose down, which means we're starting to make it achievable through a range of different means in that instance. The study was slightly different in that we focused on heart rate recovery. Okay, so where do we get that thought from? Again, if we look at patient populations, we weren't the first to think that heart rate recovery might be improved. And when we mean heart rate recovery, we're taking heart rate up to a particular
Yeah.
high percentage of peak heart rate.
Yep.
And then we're watching it very carefully in a very controlled way. Okay. Because if you think about heart rate recovery, if you've just finished an effort on a bike or a treadmill, your heart rate recovery is going to be influenced by are you standing up, lying down, continuing to exercise. So what we made sure in this study is we controlled their heart rate recovery in a very particular constant supine direction. Sorry, just to go back to where do we get the thinking from, that if we look at other populations such as cardiac disease populations, there'd already been some nice studies published by James O'Keefe and Bill Harris that had supplemented omega-3 into the cardiac patients and through cardiac stress test looked at their heart rate responses but also their heart rate recovery. So there is a nice paper published by that group that showed that the heart rate recovery in the first minute after exercise in cardiac patients had actually improved. And what we mean is that the heart rate is coming down towards rest at a faster rate. So in other words, if our heart rate goes up really high, we're returning within a given amount of time to a heart rate that's, say, below 100 beats per minute. So what we did in the 2014 study is we supplemented for our 8 weeks. We did heart rate recovery before and after in a very controlled way. And then we used some mathematical models to actually sort of look at because it's not a linear response. It goes down fast in the first 30 seconds and it can kind of tail off. So we looked at a few mathematical models to actually consider that. What we observed was there was a faster heart rate recovery after. How is this the case? Well, it gets back to the idea that we've intrinsically modified the beat rate of the heart in this instance through modifying the membranes of all the cells, not just the worker cells, but the actual cells that are involved with the electrical impulses that the heart is actually firing. And so that's sort of just further evidence that it's not the autonomic nervous system per se that we're adjusting. It's actually the intrinsic beat rate that DHA has its potential role. I'd have to say there's still a lot more work to be done on this. It's never perfect. We can always continue to probe this question, but certainly there's a common theme of both resting heart rate being reduced and heart rate recovery being improved after being on a DHA oil.
Yeah. And look, when you look at many athletes, even active people, at the end of the day, we push our heart a lot, as we try to exercise, or athletes go even further, especially endurance athletes. Is there any ideas of how omega-3 fatty acids may play a beneficial role for protecting the athlete's heart later in life?
Yeah, that's an important part. So if you step back and actually have a look at what's happening, we know that if you don't do physical activity, your heart health will be poor.
Yeah.
If you engage in physical activity, you improve your heart health. And there's a range of different reasons why. You obviously stimulate the heart to contract, it becomes stronger, it remodels, the walls become more effective in their pumping. You also improve the blood vessels, don't you, which reduces your blood pressure and your blood flow improves at the same time. So overall, your whole cardiovascular system improves. Exercise taken to the extreme for some people actually puts a lot of load on the cardiovascular system for a range of different reasons. In terms of the heart itself, it means that we could experience what we call remodeling that is pathophysiological rather than physiological. What do I mean by that? Every time we have a heartbeat, we have to fill that heart and we have to empty the heart. If we're engaged in prolonged physical activity for many hours a day, many days of the year, the heart experiences more and more volume overload over time. So there is a chance for some individuals that can result in the heart stretching, becoming a little bit more fibrotic, a little bit more ineffective in its beating because you've actually sort of tipped it over the edge in terms of its stimulus, the exercise stimulus that's occurring. So if we have a look at then the potential for omega-3, and this is, I think, potential, and it's a lot of future research because this is difficult to actually then answer this question. Can DHA actually support cardiovascular health for a lifetime when engaged in extreme physical activity? You've got to then follow people over their lifespan. We haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of this is theoretical thinking that we're doing,
Yeah.
but on the basis that we know from populations such as heart failure patients and cardiac patients that the improvement you can make to those hearts, which are pathologically remodeled because of a disease state, there's a chance that an athlete who engages in DHA as part of their diet with extreme endurance activity, that heart is going to be more likely to be supported in the long term. So we're borrowing from the cardiovascular disease state
Yeah.
to make hypotheses that this is potentially going to be true. How do we do that? Well, we've got to engage in long-term studies of athletes
Yeah.
with or without DHA as part of their diet and have a look at their heart function. Now, this is an interesting area that's evolved in the last 2 decades,
Yeah.
and it's non-invasive cardiac monitoring.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can monitor the heart through ECG.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's always been available. But ultrasound technology now means that we can actually image the heart. And when we image the heart, we can get the work of the heart. We can have a look at how much strain the wall is under. We can look at the filling. We can look at all of the dynamics of the cardiac function
Yeah.
using an ultrasound type technology, which is in theory quite a cheap way of actually doing that. So I think we've now arrived at a position where we can start to design studies looking at longer term heart health of ultra endurance athletes with a range of different things in place that can support heart function, and that includes DHA as
Yeah.
part
Yeah.
of that.
So it's clear, I mean, from what the insights you're giving us today is around, the connection between heart health and DHA. What are the underlying, physiological mechanisms by which omega-3 acids impact heart function and blood flow during
Mm.
exercise?
So we spoke a fair bit about heart, and look, we think primarily the prime mechanism for heart is a lowering of heart rate,
Yeah.
and that improves heart function, mechanical function of the heart itself. If we turn our attention a little bit more towards the blood flow is also really
Yeah.
important. When we think about blood flow, we're talking about the vessels that the blood has to move through in that instance to then obviously deliver nutrients and oxygen. And the vessels form what we call total peripheral resistance. So the heart has to pump against that resistance. Now, a nice, healthy vascular system offers low resistance. It can vasodilate on demand. So when
Mm.
you start to exercise, the vessels open up and blood goes through. It also is a low resistance when you're not exercising, meaning that your blood pressure is then obviously lower if the vascular resistance is lower overall. So there's been some interesting studies, and we haven't been directly involved with these, but some interesting studies considering is blood flow improved. And it does take us back to the Alexander Leaf study from 1988. Now, there's been less studies done on blood flow compared to heart in
Mm.
terms of the trained individuals, but where we have seen them, we've seen some what I call sort of forearm model work being done. So if you think of like rock climbers that have to kind of grab and release, you can kind of mimic that in the lab by getting someone to do repetitive arm contractions, can't you?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay, so there's been a couple of nice studies done where they've provided omega-3 to repetitive muscle contractile environments. And the observation was that the vasodilatory actions, particularly of the macro vessels, was improved, and that the conductance through the vessels was improved. But what we mean conductance was that the blood could move through those vessels a little bit easier. So it goes back to what sort of mechanisms could be involved with that. Alexander Leaf first postulated, well, maybe we're changing the red blood cell and it's squeezing through the capillaries a bit better. But if you actually think about how vessels dilate, they
Yeah.
dilate because they've got a healthy endothelium. So that's that inner layer, the inner
Yeah.
structure of the actual vessel itself. And what we do know from the two fatty acids, and it takes us back to the idea that they could perform two different roles, is there's potentially different pathways that DHA and EPA are providing for this. So from a DHA perspective, there's some interesting evidence that it's actually helping to support and stimulate nitric oxide synthase. Now, nitric oxide is a vasodilator that's really important in terms of the endothelial function for vasodilation. So there's some evidence that DHA is actually helping to support the synthase activity of that. From an EPA perspective, it's the reduction in the aggregation of platelets into the area as well. And this has been an interesting area. If we sort of just turn our attention to, there's often a lot of talk about um, omega-3 and bleeding time, isn't there?
Mm.
That you take your omega-3s and your bleeding time is going to go through the roof. And in fact, if you look at a lot of some of the clinical surveys that you might fill in prior to having surgery, your surgeon might ask, "Are you on fish oils?" And you need to actually remove those. So the question is, if you take omega-3, do you actually change from a negative perspective your bleeding time? And there has been media to suggest that that's the case. Now, it's not actually the case. And in fact, if we go back to the DHA versus the EPA and the 500 to 1,000 milligrams, we're not taking excessive amounts in the
It's a
first
small
place.
amount. Yeah, yeah.
And the other argument, and I've heard Bill Harris talk about this quite a few times, is rather than thinking about we're changing bleeding time from an adverse effect, we're actually restoring normal bleeding time. So if you actually flick it around the other way, it's actually restoring normal homeostasis
Yeah.
for how blood should be moving through our vessels,
Yeah.
rather than thinking at it from the point of view as it's a deleterious effect
Yeah.
on blood flow. So I think we can definitely say omega-3s are playing a interesting integrative role in terms of supporting blood vessels, helping vasodilation when needed, and also potentially changing the way that platelets and aggregations occurring in the periphery. So,
Yeah.
allowing blood to move through those vessels a little bit more easier.
Yeah. And I suppose when you look at your research, there's a lot of implications for the athletic performance. How do these findings from your research translate into practical benefits for athletes? How might improved heart function and recovery affect overall performance?
So, look, this is an interesting conversation that takes us into the evidence requirements of when you can say something improves your performance.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, so if we look at the Australian Institute of Sport supplement guidelines, these omega-3s plus a lot of other components of our diet that athletes are focused on, whether it's protein, whether it's nitrates, they can be classified according to good evidence. And so the Australian Institute of Sport have got 4 categories. Category A is performance enhancement. So in
mm,
other words, there's enough research out there that collective brains all together have sat around and said, look, we're pretty sure that that's worth taking from a performance enhancing point of view. Category B or Group B is supporting healthy function, supporting physiological function, but not necessarily improving how quickly you run your 10K or
yeah,
cycle your 40
yeah,
kilometers. Omega-3 falls into Group B.
yeah. Okay.
Okay, so at this point, we don't have evidence to say that it will improve one-off performances, but what we have evidence is that it can improve the support to body tissues that are
Yep.
put under stress when performing, is the best way of putting it.
Yeah.
If I just quickly go through that, category C are supplements or parts of the nutrient intake that are interesting but have really no evidence at this point in time, and so they're topical, but they're emerging at this point. And obviously, category D are the illegal based performance enhancers. So omega-3s form into Group B. That's been agreed upon. They're supporting performance through a range of different physiological mechanisms. Now, what's interesting about omega-3s compared to a lot of other supplements is it goes back to the membrane hypothesis. Every cell in our body has a membrane.
Mm,
And so by incorporating EPA and DHA into our diet, we have an opportunity for both those fatty acids to be making their way into the phospholipid bilipid layer of
yeah.
every cell in the body.
Yeah.
And then each of those cells will make the most physiological benefit from those. So if I'm a heart cell, all the things that we've been talking about in this episode of intrinsic beat rate, for example, if I'm a red blood cell,
Yeah.
changes in the way that the membrane can be more fluid to fit through capillaries
Yeah.
is a good example there.
Are there any other supplements that help improve the effectiveness of DHA that you could take with DHA?
With DHA.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting. This has been an area where there are studies that have combined omega-3 and DHA with, say, amino acid or a protein-based supplement at the same time. What's interesting is the types of topics that have been looked at are older adults, for example, that experience sarcopenia, where
Yeah.
we know protein is an important part of actually maintaining muscle mass.
Yeah.
And then, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this later in a future podcast, the idea that omega-3 potentially with protein under certain conditions can help support maintaining or preventing sarcopenia for example.
Yeah.
So um, there are studies that have combined omega-3 with protein, for example, or omega-3 with an antioxidant is another example. Um, what those studies don't then allow us to do is to split up
Mm.
what is the effect of omega-3. So you have to then combine the outcome of those studies, say it's omega-3 plus something else,
Yeah.
and you can't say it's omega-3 on its own. But probably the two major ones is omega-3 plus protein or omega-3 plus an antioxidant.
Well, that's probably some good insights for companies who are producing sports nutrition, right?
Yeah.
To
I think that's another area that we'll probably be looking at and it's like most parts of the diet, is there is no one single part of the diet.
correct.
It's the combination of how the diet interacts with each other and how different parts of our diets help support. So, if again taking the muscle protein synthesis that we'll talk about later, if we take that as an important pathway to maintaining muscle mass, and DHA is showing some good signs that it can help support that. Well, it
Yeah.
needs the protein amino acids to be available
Yeah, sure.
to be able to support that process.
I suppose I want to move on to the optimal dosage and sources. Based on your research, what was the optimal dosage of omega-3 for athletes looking for enhanced heart rate function and recovery? And more in particular, why is DHA really important in this context? Are there specific sources of or supplements you would recommend for
Mm,
athletes
yeah.
across the board, elite, active people?
Yeah. So in terms of, I mean, it's good that we talked about those two studies. The first study I've given over 2,000 milligrams, and the second study we're back down at
Fine.
500 to 600. And what we've seen is we can have cardiac impact with both. So that tells us that we don't have to be at those higher 1,000+ milligrams all year round. That we can sustain a good omega-3 index
Mm,
through 500 to 600, with some periods of the year where we might be, obviously increasing our intake for a period of time and coming back down. So again, that boils back to heart function, heart health associated at population level with 2 to 3 fatty fish meals per week, which would deliver again around about that 500, 600 milligrams of DHA. So the concept then is that if we can show physiological impact by supplying that in an RCT design to trained individuals who already have good heart function. So that's an interesting part about the studies that we've done. You'd think, oh, they're already trained, they've already improved their heart function to some extent.
mm,
They're not elite, but certainly you'd think at that point, well, how much more gain can you get? Well, the idea of DHA providing some extra benefit on top of the already trained state of that heart means that there is still room for cellular improvements of the heart tissue
mm,
on top of the improvements that exercise training provides in itself.
mm.
So I would say, to answer that question, we can lean on the cardiovascular impact of increasing the omega-3 index to above 8% using 500 to 600 milligrams. Or if you know that you're already depleted in or low in DHA intake, you might choose to take above 1,000 for a period of time before falling back down into that sort of maintenance period
Yeah.
at that stage.
That has a lot to say with, when companies are wanting to develop a product, what they put inside it in terms of whether it's a supplement or a powder. Clearly, DHA is now a critical item when it comes to performance related to the heart and muscle function, right?
Mm. Yeah, look, I would agree. EPA seems to be playing roles more out in the
Yeah,
vascular, but the common message through both pathophysiological studies, community or cohort-based studies, and then studies that involve looking at heart function in trained individuals,
yeah,
DHA definitely does seem to be the preferential fatty acid. And it just boils back to the conversations we've had before about when those two fatty acids are increased in the diet, DHA preferentially is selected by the cardiomyocytes, the heart cells,
mm,
to bank and become more prevalent in the phospholipid layer of the heart cells itself. And we see less EPA actually present in those heart cells.
yeah. So just in terms of for an athlete or an active person wanting to incorporate omega-3s in their training regime, what advice would you give athletes or active individuals who want to incorporate omega-3s in training, and how can they effectively monitor and manage their omega-3
Mm.
levels.
Yeah. Okay. So important part about uptaking fats into our
Mm.
system is that the presentation to that needs to be with whole foods and meals. So even if
Yeah,
you're choosing to take an omega-3 through a supplement, taking a supplement on an empty stomach is
not
going
good.
to be fairly ineffective or less effective than actually presenting those fats with a meal where the rest of the digestive tract can identify that and then obviously use its enzymatic processes to select the fat, uptake that fat, and then obviously then distribute that back to the liver and into the circulation, eventually the cells. So rather than seeing the omega-3 as something I take before or after training, you're actually looking at making sure whether you're using omega-3 through whole foods
Mm.
or through supplements, it has to be part of food intake and dietary intake. So it's being presented on full stomachs rather than empty stomachs. And again, I've come across this by, or this interpretation of taking it before or after training because of, oh, well, okay, well, that's when the stress is occurring. By working with, a range of sports dietitians or clinicians, and then trying to emphasize to them that at that point in time you've actually, or the barn door's already been open, hasn't it? You should have been working on that through a consistent intake over a period of time,
Yep.
presenting it with meal based approaches
Yep.
rather than actually seeing it as something that's directly associated with the half an hour before, half an hour after training.
Yeah.
So it's getting the idea that we need to be incorporating, and I like to use the term banking our omega-3s into our membranes
Yeah.
for the future,
Yep.
rather than actually seeing them as something I need to take because I've just actually completed some sort of
Yeah.
arduous activity.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you need to take your omega-3s not on an empty stomach. So there's a great play for sports nutrition companies who want to do powders and functional foods, an opportunity to add DHA
Mm.
into their foods to provide the athletes with these benefits, right?
It's actually a really interesting and exciting area of omega-3 where, again, if I go back to the review that we talked about on the last episode, it was all through classic capsule.
Yeah.
And look, from a research point of view, it's an easy way to give your participants an omega-3. But I think from the point of view of translation to practice for athletes in real teams, if you've got a squad of 50 athletes, they're all not going to have the same requirements for food
Yeah.
intake, or some people can't actually swallow a capsule.
Correct.
So it's actually really important that sports dietitians have got options for working with individual athletes amongst larger squads,
Mm.
so they have a variety of choices of how to improve omega-3 intake across the longer term, because again it boils down to the consistency, isn't it? So you
Yeah.
need to engage in something that becomes a a process that becomes a normal, non-arduous intake of omega-3. It doesn't
Correct.
become difficult, and so therefore it sits in the background. And so incorporating into whole foods is actually a really exciting translation to practice that we're going to see in probably the next decade.
In terms of future research directions, what are the research do you believe need further exploration in the field of omega-3 fatty acids and in particular in exercise physiology? Are there any emerging trends or questions you're particularly interested in?
So on the basis of what we've been talking about in the last half an hour or so in terms of cardiovascular function, the primary outcomes have been blood flow and heart rate. And I mentioned before, the non-invasive power of ultrasound now means that a lot of our knowledge around omega-3 and DHA improving cardiac mechanics has come from very intricate lab or animal-based studies, or even cellular studies where you take cardiomyocytes out and put them in a cell bath.
Mm.
We're actually now looking at an opportunity where we can investigate DHA and heart function over a long period of time using non-invasive cardiac ultrasonography,
Yeah.
which means that we can actually look at heart filling, heart emptying, strain on the wall, as well as heart rate. So you can actually look at the combined effect of DHA on total heart function
Mm.
rather than heart rate alone. So we've only probably just tipped the surface in terms of heart rate. But if DHA is affecting heart rate, it's logical that it's also affecting other cardiac mechanics. And sure, we know about that from lab environments, but let's translate that into human environments. And now you can actually couple that with, if we talk about the athlete situation, you can couple that with following endurance athletes, whether they're Ironman athletes, Tour de France athletes, powerlifting athletes, and how that could potentially help support heart function over years rather than just the 12-week intervention.
Yeah, correct. Thank you, Greg, for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights. It's been a pleasure discussing these important findings. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope you find this discussion on omega-3 fatty acids and heart informative. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore the science behind sports and nutrition from a DHA perspective. Our next podcast, we are exploring the impact of omega-3 fatty acids and its impact on training and competing in sports and exercise.
DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle recovery will go far. With Omega-3, your shining star.